The night was ink black over the English countryside. Only the rhythmic hum of German Heinkel bombers broke the silence. Below, a city slept under blackout curtains, no street lamps, no headlights, just the pulse of fear beneath the quiet. Then, in an instant, the sky erupted. Searchlights pierced the darkness like white blades, converging on a lone bomber. The guns of a Bofors battery thundered to life. Inside the German cockpit, panic. How could they see us in this darkness? By dawn, the rumours had already spread. Somewhere in Kent, it was said, British pilots had developed superhuman vision men who could spot enemy planes in the pitch-black night. The reason, the Germans whispered, was absurd. They were eating carrots. The idea seemed laughable until night after night, the RAF struck with uncanny precision, intercepting bombers in the dark while Germany's best pilots vanished into the clouds. The Luftwaffe command began to worry. Had Britain discovered a new weapon? A chemical enhancer? A secret night vision diet? In reality, the truth behind this stupid carrot myth was far darker and far more brilliant than anyone could have imagined. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Low Countries lay under Nazi occupation. And across the English Channel, the German Luftwaffe massed for what Hitler called Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. In daylight, the Battle of Britain raged. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes rose from fields in Kent and Sussex, clawing at waves of German bombers. It was a fight for survival, a duel of courage and attrition. But by October 1940, the tides of war shifted. After suffering catastrophic losses in daylight attacks, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. They turned to the darkness. London's nights became a nightmare. The city went black, streetlights dimmed, windows covered with heavy blackout curtains. Only the low drone of bombers and the rising wail of sirens pierced the stillness. Anti-aircraft shells burst over the Thames like ghastly fireworks. Flames rose from factories, homes and churches. It was the beginning of the Blitz, 8 months of terror from the sky. For the Royal Air Force, this new phase brought a nearly impossible challenge. Fighter Command had trained for daylight combat dogfights where pilots could see their enemies. But at night, the sky became an invisible battlefield. The Hurricanes and Spitfires, heroes of the daylight war, were nearly useless in the dark. Pilots flew blind. Radar, still a closely guarded secret, could barely detect the altitude of an incoming bomber, let alone direct a fighter to intercept it. The results were grim. In the early months of the night blitz, British defences failed to stop the German bombers. Cities burned freely, while RAF pilots, unable to see even a wingtip, patrolled the darkness in futility. The Air Ministry was desperate. Night after night, civilians asked the same question. How can the Germans find us so easily, and why can't our boys stop them? Behind closed doors at Bentley Priory, headquarters of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding wrestled with an impossible problem. The solution had to come from innovation, not brute force. That innovation began along the coastline, hidden in plain sight. Since the late 1930s, British scientists under Sir Robert Watson-Watt had been quietly constructing a chain of tall, skeletal towers known as the Chain Home Radar System. These towers, stretching from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, could detect enemy aircraft before they reached the coast. It was the world's first operational radar network, and it changed warfare forever. But there was a catch. Radar could tell where bombers were coming from, not where they were going. The data was crude, the screens primitive, and the coordination between radar operators, ground controllers and pilots was still experimental. To turn radar detection into successful interception, something else was needed: night fighters. In late 1940, the RAF began forming specialized squadrons equipped with radar-assisted aircraft, the Bristol Blenheim, and later, the formidable Bristol Beaufighter. These planes carried new airborne interception, AI, radar units, allowing their crews to hunt bombers in darkness. Operators tracked ghostly blips on cathode ray screens, while pilots navigated by instruments alone, guided by faint echoes bouncing off enemy aircraft. This new kind of combat was cold, calculated, and silent. There were no dogfights, only ambushes in the night. The system was still primitive, and secrecy was paramount. If the Germans discovered that Britain had radar-guided night fighters, they would immediately adapt. So the Ministry of Information devised a plan, one of the most ingenious pieces of wartime deception ever conceived. They would hide the truth in plain sight. And so, as newspapers reported increasing RAF success in intercepting German bombers, a peculiar story began to circulate. British pilots, it said, were developing astonishing night vision thanks to a steady diet of carrots. It was propaganda with purpose, and it worked. The myth spread like wildfire through Britain and occupied Europe. People laughed, but they also believed. Farmers were told to grow more carrots. Civilians were urged to eat them during blackouts to help see in the dark. Behind this absurd idea lay Britain's greatest wartime secret, one powerful enough to save a nation, yet hidden behind the simplest of lies. And at the center of it all was a quiet campaign of misinformation, orchestrated with surgical precision by British intelligence. By late 1940, Britain was burning yet unbroken. Each night, the Luftwaffe unleashed waves of bombers over London, Coventry, and Liverpool. The fires could be seen for miles, turning the night sky crimson. And yet, beneath that chaos, Britain was quietly turning the tide not through numbers or firepower, but through secrecy. The key lay in a technology so advanced it seemed almost impossible for its time: radar. Officially called radio detection and ranging, radar was one of the most closely guarded military secrets of the Second World War. It could detect aircraft beyond the range of sight or sound, giving the RAF precious minutes to prepare. But the true game-changer was airborne interception radar, a miniature radar set that could fit inside a fighter aircraft. Developed by scientists at Bawdsey Research Station and later at TRE Telecommunications Research Establishment, this system allowed pilots to chase bombers in total darkness. The new Bristol Beaufighter, with its AI Mk.4 radar, became a silent predator of the night sky. However, the British government faced a major problem. They could not let Germany find out how their night fighters were suddenly so successful. At first, the Luftwaffe dismissed the idea that Britain had such technology. Their intelligence officers believed radar required massive ground installations like the chain-home towers along the coast. The idea that a fighter plane could carry its own radar was considered science fiction. Yet, the evidence on the ground told a different story. German bomber crews began reporting bizarre encounters. Beaufighters appearing out of nowhere, attacking from below or behind in pitch darkness, then vanishing without a trace. Luftwaffe intelligence demanded an explanation. They scoured reports, analysed British news, even questioned captured pilots. But the answer that filtered through seemed absurd. The British were eating carrots. The story began innocently enough, a small human interest piece in the Daily Telegraph in late 1940. It described an RAF pilot named John Cunningham who had become famous for his incredible success as a night fighter. His nickname was Cat's Eyes. The article explained, quite seriously, that his superb night vision was thanks to his love of carrots. Behind the article was a quiet directive from the Ministry of Information, the department responsible for British wartime propaganda. The goal was to cover up the sudden effectiveness of the RAF's night defences by attributing it to something harmless and patriotic. Soon, posters appeared across the country urging civilians to eat carrots to see better in the blackout. Radio broadcasts and newspapers repeated the message. What started as a cover story for radar became a nationwide phenomenon. The timing was perfect. Britain was facing food shortages due to German U-boats cutting off imports. Fresh produce was scarce, but carrots easy to grow and store were abundant. The government turned the myth into a practical campaign. If people believed carrots could help them see during blackouts, they'd eat more of them and ease pressure on limited food supplies. Propaganda leaflets showed smiling families munching carrots under dim lights. Cartoon rabbits urged children to see in the dark like fighter pilots. Even Dr. Carrot, a fictional cartoon doctor, appeared in magazines offering advice on nutrition and vision. The psychological effect was immense. People genuinely believed carrots improved night sight. RAF pilots played along, joking about their carrot diets before night missions. But beneath the humor lay a deadly serious purpose. The longer the Germans believed Britain's secret was biological rather than technological, the longer radar would remain untouchable. The deception worked flawlessly. Luftwaffe command took the bait. Reports began circulating that British pilots were using a special diet to enhance their night vision. German intelligence even conducted its own dietary studies, analyzing vitamin A's effects on eyesight. They found some truth. Vitamin A does support healthy vision, but nowhere near enough to explain the RAF's success. Still, the seed of doubt was planted. If the British had discovered a biochemical edge, it meant the Luftwaffe's advantage in the air was not as absolute as Hitler believed. The carrot myth, ridiculous on its surface, had become an information weapon, a perfect smokescreen. For months, it protected Britain's most valuable wartime secret: the existence of airborne radar and the expanding night fighter command. As the Blitz intensified through winter, German bombers found themselves hunted in the dark by unseen enemies, while their commanders kept chasing a vegetable-based illusion. What began as a propaganda trick had evolved into a psychological operation of remarkable brilliance. And for the men who flew those night missions, like Cat's Eyes Cunningham, the myth became both a shield and a secret burden. In wartime Britain, belief could be as powerful as weaponry. By late 1940, the blackout had transformed ordinary life into an experiment in darkness. Every evening, streets vanished into shadow. Civilians navigated their homes by candlelight or the faint glow of rationed lamps. Car headlights were covered with slit masks, reducing their beams to thin lines. Accidents soared. Pedestrians stumbled into ditches, collided with lampposts, and fell from curbs they couldn't see. The Ministry of Information needed not just obedience to the blackout, but morale. And then came the message: carrots help you see in the dark. It was simple, comforting, and oddly patriotic. If eating carrots could help a mother find her way to the shelter or help a child overcome fear of the dark, it made sense to believe. Posters showed smiling families holding torches and bowls of carrots. Pamphlets suggested carrots as a blackout snack. Even in the countryside, farmers embraced the message. Schools distributed carrots to children during lunch. Housewives experimented with carrot jam and carrot pudding. It wasn't just propaganda, it became a way of life. The ministry's campaign united practicality with myth. Carrots were easy to grow, rich in nutrients, and in surplus. But the deeper brilliance lay in psychology. A frightened population found a small, tangible way to feel empowered. For the British public, seeing in the dark wasn't about technology, it was about resilience. It gave ordinary people a sense that science, nature, and determination could conquer fear. Meanwhile, RAF pilots quietly chuckled among themselves. They knew that their real night vision came from radar screens, glowing faintly green in their cockpits. But the myth served a purpose far beyond nutrition. It protected their secret and their lives. For many of these airmen, like squadron leader John Cunningham, the line between myth and reality blurred. Newspapers called him Cat's Eyes so often that even his ground crews referred to him that way. He never publicly contradicted the story. When asked about his success, he'd give a modest smile and say, "Yes, I do eat a lot of carrots." He played his role in the Great Deception not for glory, but for survival. 2. The tactical angle, the radar war, in the night sky, while civilians munched carrots in their kitchens. The RAF's Night Fighter Command was undergoing a transformation unlike anything seen in air warfare before. At the heart of it was an idea that technology could replace eyesight. The early AI Mk.4 radar units fitted inside Bristol Beaufighters and later Mosquitoes were crude but revolutionary. The operator, seated behind the pilot, watched a tiny cathode ray tube displaying two green blips, one for their own aircraft, one for the enemy. The closer the blips, the nearer the target. In the darkness, the pilot trusted only that faint glow. Ground-based, GCI, ground-controlled interception, stations guided fighters toward enemy bombers, relaying bearing, range and altitude via radio. Once within a few miles, the onboard radar took over. The operator called out corrections in calm, measured tones left 2 degrees, steady, range 1 mile. Then, often without ever seeing the enemy with the naked eye, the pilot fired into the void. A sudden explosion would confirm a hit. These encounters were over in seconds, but they represented the fusion of human skill and machine precision. The Germans had no idea how Britain was coordinating these invisible attacks. They assumed the British had somehow trained their pilots to navigate perfectly at night, perhaps with drugs or diet enhancements. Their analysts tried to account for the growing number of bombers lost over the Channel. Nothing fit the data. The truth was that Britain had created an early network defense, an analog version of what modern militaries would call integrated air command. Radar stations, observers, radio operators and pilots acted as one machine, each feeding the other with slivers of information. And all the while, the Ministry of Information's Carrot campaign kept German intelligence pointed in the wrong direction. It was, in effect, one of the first information wars fought not with bullets or bombs, but with rumours and belief. At RAF bases like Middle Wallop and Church Fenton, pilots flew through sleepless nights, their faces lit by the eerie glow of radar screens. They were exhausted, undertrained, and often terrified. Yet, interception success rates climbed. By early 1941, the RAF's radar-assisted night fighters were destroying up to 15% of German bombers per raid, an extraordinary improvement. Luftwaffe reports grew increasingly desperate. Some pilots refused to fly night missions over Britain, claiming the enemy could see through the dark. The carrot myth, absurd as it sounded, began to feel real even to the enemy. Because, in a sense, it was real. Not in the way of vitamins or vision, but in its impact. It was the veil that concealed Britain's technological revolution. Night after night, the rhythm continued. German bombers crossed the Channel. Radar picked up their signatures. British controllers vectored fighters into their paths, and somewhere in the darkness, a cat's eyes pilot lined up the shot. When the wreckage of a Heinkel or Dornier was found smouldering in a field the next morning, villagers would whisper, "The carrots are working." They weren't wrong, just not in the way they thought. The success of radar and the cover story that shielded it marked a turning point in Britain's defensive strategy. But behind the public smiles and wartime posters lay deeper consequences, moral, scientific, and psychological. Because the carrot myth, while brilliant, was also an experiment in truth itself. Every war is fought on two fronts: the battlefield and the mind. And in the dark winter of 1940, Britain's Ministry of Information understood something profound. Truth alone doesn't win wars, belief does. The carrot myth became one of the most successful examples of psychological warfare ever executed because it struck the perfect balance between credibility and absurdity. It was believable enough to spread, ridiculous enough to be memorable, and patriotic enough to inspire. For the average British citizen, carrots represented thrift, health, and self-reliance virtues needed in wartime. For the Luftwaffe, the story created doubt. If British pilots had night vision diets, what else might they be hiding? In the fog of war, uncertainty is lethal. The Germans had already been rattled by Britain's uncanny radar coverage during daylight raids. The sudden leap in accuracy during night missions shattered their assumptions about British capability. The idea of a human enhancement, even through something as mundane as diet, was a comforting explanation for the unexplainable. Rumors began circulating within Luftwaffe circles that Britain was experimenting with visual training regimes, special optical drugs, or food-based sight enhancers. Some German doctors even proposed that beta-carotene from carrots might be converted into a retinal compound, improving low-light vision. In Berlin, the Reich Air Ministry quietly commissioned scientific inquiries into the theory. None produced conclusive results. But that didn't matter. The seed of confusion had been planted. Meanwhile, the carrot campaign worked inwardly as well. Within Britain, it became a coping mechanism, a way to rationalize terror. Civilians no longer felt entirely powerless during air raids. If the enemy had bombs, the British had carrots, a small, symbolic act of control. It was wartime psychology at its finest. The Ministry of Information had crafted a lie so perfect that it didn't merely conceal truth, it comforted the nation. Even after the war, many veterans and civilians still believed the myth. It wasn't until years later that official declassifications revealed the truth. That radar, not vegetables, had turned the tide of the night war. But by then, the myth had taken on a life of its own, a gentle deception that had protected one of Britain's greatest wartime secrets. It wasn't just propaganda anymore. It was folklore. 4. The scientific angle, the real science behind the myth. To understand why the carrot myth worked so well, it helps to know that it wasn't entirely false. There is a link, faint but real, between carrots and vision. Carrots are rich in beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A, an essential nutrient for eye health. A deficiency in vitamin A can lead to a condition called night blindness, difficulty seeing in low light. So technically, eating carrots helps maintain normal vision. But it doesn't give anyone superhuman night sight. The Ministry of Information didn't invent the science, they simply stretched it. They took a kernel of truth and inflated it into legend. And that made the myth unassailable. Scientists could confirm that vitamin A helped eyesight, which made the propaganda sound plausible. It was one of the earliest examples of scientific disinformation, the selective use of real science to support a false conclusion. Even within the RAF, many lower-ranking personnel weren't told about radar. Mechanics, ground crews, and even some pilots believed the carrot story to some degree. The less people knew, the less they could reveal if captured. In that way, the carrot myth served another purpose: operational security. But the true science unfolding behind the myth was far more sophisticated. The development of radar, particularly airborne radar, represented a leap in physics, engineering, and electronics that bordered on miraculous. Inside a small compartment of the Beaufighter's nose sat the magnetron, a device capable of producing powerful, focused radio waves. It was the beating heart of radar technology. British scientists guarded it with near-religious secrecy. Had Germany discovered it, they could have neutralized Britain's entire early warning network or replicated it themselves. The magnetron would later become the basis for Allied radar systems in all theaters of the war, and after 1945, the foundation of modern microwave technology. But in 1940, it was a ghost known only to a handful of people, hidden beneath a national joke about vegetables. There's irony in how such a monumental scientific achievement was protected by such a humble story. A lie wrapped in truth. A breakthrough hidden in plain sight. The myth even shaped British domestic policy. Nutrition pamphlets emphasized vitamin A as a vision vitamin. School programs taught children to eat more carrots for sharp eyes. Posters showed pilots and cartoon heroes with super sight. By 1941, carrot consumption in Britain had nearly doubled. The Ministry of Food even introduced new recipes: carrot biscuits, carrot marmalade, carrot soup. The propaganda had achieved 3 objectives simultaneously: protected radar secrecy, boosted morale and compliance with blackouts, addressed wartime food shortages. All from a single story. The Germans, meanwhile, continued searching for an explanation. Reconnaissance photos of radar stations puzzled them. Reports of downed bombers mentioned unseen pursuers. but nothing in their intelligence analysis pointed to radar. The idea that Britain had combined electromagnetic detection, air coordination, and interception control was simply beyond the scope of what the Luftwaffe believed possible. The carrot myth had bought the British time precious months to refine radar tactics, train crews, and expand the network. It was, in every sense, a masterstroke of misinformation. By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late. Britain's radar advantage had grown unassailable. And as 1941 unfolded, the psychological, tactical, and scientific threads of the myth all converged into one inevitable moment, the turning point of the Night War. Because soon, the Germans would begin to suspect that the carrot diet story didn't add up. And the truth, invisible and electromagnetic, would finally reveal itself in the skies. By early 1941, the Battle of Britain had entered its second phase, the Battle of the Beams. The Luftwaffe had turned increasingly to night raids, using radio navigation systems like Nikkibeam, X-Gerät, and Y-Gerät to guide their bombers through the darkness. These systems sent beams of radio waves from occupied Europe, crossing over Britain like invisible highways in the sky. Where two beams intersected, the bombers would drop their payloads. The precision was chilling. The Germans believed this gave them an unbeatable advantage. But they underestimated Britain's scientists and their secret mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum. At Bentley Priory and Bawdsey Manor, the British countered with a new strategy: bending the beams. Engineers under Dr. Robert Cockburn developed ways to detect and jam the German signals, throwing bombers off course by miles. While radar guided the RAF's fighters, counter-radar scrambled the enemy's navigation. It was a silent, invisible war fought in frequencies, oscillations, and interference. The irony was rich: both sides were now waging a battle of radio waves. But only one side knew the other's secret. And the cover story, the carrots, still held firm. Each night, the sky above Britain became an electronic chessboard. German Heinkels and Dorniers flew in ordered streams, their navigators glued to dials and beeping transmitters. Down below, the chain home radar stations detected their approach long before they crossed the coast. Within minutes, a network of telephone lines lit up. Controllers at Fighter Command relayed positions to GCI stations, where radar operators tracked bombers on phosphorescent screens. Bandits at Angels 10, heading northwest. Orders went out. Engines roared to life. The Bristol Beaufighters' heavy, twin-engined night fighters rose into the cold, clouded sky. Inside each cockpit, darkness reigned. The pilot relied on his instrument's artificial horizon, altimeter, airspeed indicator, while his radar operator watched the faint, flickering trace on a cathode screen. Contact, 5 miles, closing fast. The pilot banked sharply, adjusting to the operator's voice. 2 degrees left, range 1 mile, nothing but blackness. Then, through the gloom, a faint silhouette appeared, the hulking shadow of a Heinkel bomber. The Beaufighters' cannons thundered. A burst of fire tore through the night. The bomber erupted in flame, its wreckage falling silently into the countryside below. Another interception. Another ghost kill. And the Germans still didn't know how. By February 1941, the success rate of RAF night fighters had soared. Entire squadrons were now devoted to night interception. No. 604 Squadron, led by men like Cat's Eyes Cunningham, became the stuff of legend. In 1 month alone, Cunningham downed 5 enemy bombers, all at night. His calm demeanor and extraordinary precision earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross and a nicknamed Immortality in the press. Every article mentioned carrots. Every interview repeated the same line. Our boys eat plenty of carrots, that's why they can see so well in the dark. Behind the myth, Cunningham and his crew were operating one of the most sophisticated systems of warfare in existence, fusing airborne radar, radio control, and pilot instinct into a single lethal rhythm. The Germans, still convinced the British advantage was human rather than technical, continued to experiment with diet and vision training among their own pilots. But the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign was losing momentum. In Berlin, the ACLA Oberkommando der Luftwaffe faced growing frustration. Losses were mounting, morale was slipping, and navigation was faltering due to British jamming. Reports from returning crews were hauntingly similar. They find us in total darkness, they attack from nowhere, they see us before we see them. Even Hermann Göring, the once proud head of the Luftwaffe, demanded answers. How could Britain, a nation supposedly on the brink of starvation, strike so effectively at night? His intelligence officers presented the only consistent explanation available. The British had developed advanced night training programs and were using a nutrient-based visual enhancer. Göring reportedly scoffed but had nothing better to believe. The carrot myth had now evolved beyond propaganda. It was an official deception embedded in German intelligence assessments. In the darkness over Britain, radar and myth danced together, one real, one imagined, but both working toward the same goal: to defend the island. And it was working. By mid-1941, the number of bombers reaching their targets dropped dramatically. Those that did often missed by miles due to beam distortion. RAF night fighters were now intercepting up to 20% of incoming aircraft. The Luftwaffe's strategy, designed to terrorize Britain into submission, was unraveling. Meanwhile, in Whitehall, the Ministry of Information watched with quiet satisfaction. The carrot story continued to dominate food campaigns, now exported even to allied nations. Posters in America and Canada urged children to eat carrots the British way to see in the dark. A joke had become global. But beneath the humor, a new era of warfare was dawning, one defined by information, deception, and electromagnetic mastery. Britain's success at night marked more than just survival. It was the birth of the modern intelligence war, where truth became a weapon and technology, the new form of sight. As spring arrived, the night raids began to slow. Hitler's attention was shifting eastward toward Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. But before the bombers departed British skies for good, one final wave of attacks would test everything the RAF had built: radar, tactics, and the deception that had protected it all. A battle that would decide whether Britain's night defences were truly invincible. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe launched one of its most intense bombing waves, yet a last, furious attempt to crush British morale before turning east toward the Soviet Union. It became known as the May Blitz. For 7 nights, the bombers came in endless streams, targeting London, Liverpool, Hull, and Belfast. Thousands of tons of explosives rained down. Fire brigades fought infernos while searchlights carved the sky. Yet something had changed, something the Germans could not explain. Their navigation beams were unreliable. Their formations scattered. And one after another, bombers simply vanished. The night war had turned decisively against them. At Fighter Command headquarters, the coordination was near seamless. Radar stations along the coast tracked incoming raids, GCI operators directed squadrons into position, and airborne radar brought the final kill. Every step of the chain worked in synchronization, the product of months of testing, secrecy, and training. In one night, over 30 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed, many without a single British fighter ever visually spotting them first. To the German crews, it was witchcraft. Pilots described being attacked from invisible angles. Some claimed they were followed by soundless aircraft that struck with perfect accuracy and disappeared into the dark. Others swore the British could see through clouds. The psychological toll was enormous. Within Luftwaffe units, whispers of Die Karotten Piloten, the carrot pilots, began to circulate, half in jest, half in fear. The very myth the British had sown now haunted the enemy's morale. In Berlin, Göring's intelligence bureau, Luftwaffenführungsstab, scrambled for explanations. Reconnaissance photos showed strange tower networks along the British coast, but analysts still interpreted them as radio beacons, not radar. When captured British leaflets and newspaper clippings mentioned carrots, they seemed laughable, yet they matched the observable fact. British night fighter efficiency had improved drastically since the carrot campaigns began. Desperation gave way to absurdity. One German intelligence summary, declassified decades later, even recommended that Luftwaffe pilots maintain vitamin-rich diets to improve night sight performance. The deception had achieved full cycle. What began as propaganda to protect radar now lived inside German tactical doctrine. Back in Britain, the campaign was at its peak. The Ministry of Information doubled down on the carrot message, saturating newspapers and cinema reels with cheerful, colourful graphics. Cartoon rabbits and smiling pilots filled screens between newsreels of the Blitz. Slogans like "Carrots keep you clear-sighted in the blackout" and "Carrots help you see Jerry coming" became cultural mantras. The public ate it up literally. Children crunched raw carrots on their way to air raid shelters. Women's magazines published recipes for carrot curry, carrot pie, and even carrot fudge. Farmers' production quotas were rewritten to favour the vegetable. And behind all this cheerful absurdity, radar towers hummed in silence, feeding Fighter Command with data that was saving the country. The success of the deception wasn't only in what it made people believe, it was in what it prevented them from asking. Not a single journalist, scientist, or politician leaked a word about radar. The nation believed the cover story so completely that Britain's greatest wartime innovation remained invisible, hiding in plain sight beneath a plate of vegetables. Meanwhile, inside the cockpits, the reality was far from cheerful. Flying radar-equipped Beaufighters was among the most dangerous jobs in the RAF. The missions were long, monotonous, and terrifying. Crews flew for hours in pitch-black skies, often in poor weather, guided only by faint blips on the radar scope. The radar operator, usually seated behind the pilot, bore immense pressure. A single miscalculation could send both men spiraling into the ground. Yet, despite the danger, morale remained high. Success bred confidence, and for the first time Britain's airmen felt they were striking back. Men like John Cunningham, Brants Burbridge, and Cyril Bam Bamberger became living proof of Britain's growing mastery of the night sky. Their names appeared in the papers constantly, each mention wrapped in the same familiar myth: carrots. Cunningham, the ace whose radar-assisted kills earned him fame, later admitted after the war that he played along deliberately. "We never spoke of radar," he said. "It was too important. If carrots helped keep that secret, then carrots it was." The climax of this deception came not with a single battle, but with a realization. By mid-1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance finally began detecting faint transmissions from RAF fighters' emissions consistent with radar frequencies. German scientists in occupied France confirmed it. The British were using miniature radar sets in the air. The truth had broken through. But it was too late. The radar advantage had already been perfected, mass-produced, and integrated into every layer of Britain's air defence. The technology was years ahead of anything Germany could replicate. And the months, even years, that the carrot myth had bought Britain had been enough to change the course of the air war forever. When the Luftwaffe finally scaled down the night blitz in May 1941, Hitler's attention turned eastward to Russia. The campaign against Britain had failed. London still stood. Radar still hummed along the coast. And the carrot posters still smiled from walls and shop fronts across the country. The lie had done its duty. The night war was no longer Germany's. It belonged to the shadows Britain had learned to see through, not with carrots, but with science, deception, and courage. The end of the Blitz did not bring the end of the carrot story. If anything, it grew deeper roots in the soil of British culture. By summer 1941, as bombing slowed and Hitler's attention turned toward Russia, Britain entered a period of uneasy calm. Food remained scarce, morale fragile, and secrecy still paramount. The government couldn't reveal the radar secret, not yet. The war was far from over. So the myth lived on. The Ministry of Information continued to promote carrots with renewed enthusiasm. What had begun as a cover story was now a cornerstone of Britain's wartime nutrition propaganda. Posters carried slogans like "Carrots keep you healthy and bright-eyed," and "Carrots the secret of night vision." Cartoon mascots like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete became household names. Children sang jingles about carrots on BBC broadcasts. Farmers grew record crops across the countryside, encouraged by the Ministry of Food to dig for victory and fill the nation's plates with orange. For the public, the campaign was a symbol of resilience, a small, cheerful defiance against the darkness of war. For the government, it remained a convenient mask over something far more precious: Britain's command of the invisible battlefield. Inside RAF Command, meanwhile, radar had evolved from a fragile experiment to a decisive weapon. The success of night fighter interceptions convinced military planners that electronic warfare was no longer a niche, it was the future. The British Airborne Interception Radar was continuously upgraded through 1942 and beyond. The AIMK. The eighth, using centimetric radar made possible by the cavity magnetron, allowed even greater precision. For the first time, night fighters could see through clouds, rain, and darkness with near-surgical accuracy. These advances were shared cautiously with Allied forces through secret coordination with the Americans and Canadians. By 1943, the magnetron design had crossed the Atlantic under the Tizard mission, sparking a radar revolution that transformed air defense across the Allied world. And all that time, the story of the Carrot pilots continued to echo in public imagination, harmless, humorous, and useful. It had done what no bullet, bomb, or radar pulse could. It had hidden the truth in plain sight. Even as the RAF grew stronger, the myth spread internationally. American newspapers reprinted the story of Cat's Eyes Cunningham, marveling at his carrot-fueled vision. In the United States, wartime nutrition campaigns echoed the British line: "Eat vitamin A, keep your eyes sharp for victory." In Canada and Australia too, posters linked carrots to better vision, creating a shared narrative of Allied ingenuity. Few realized it was born from a deception designed to fool the enemy. The irony was almost poetic. While German scientists scrambled to catch up with British radar, developing their own versions, like the Liechtenstein radar for night fighters, their research had been delayed by a vegetable. By the time they fielded their own systems in late 1941, Britain had already advanced 2 generations ahead. The carrot myth, trivial on its surface, had bought precious time months that translated into thousands of saved lives. It wasn't just propaganda anymore, it had become an instrument of strategic delay. In the years that followed, as Allied bombing raids over Germany intensified, the tables turned completely. Now it was the Luftwaffe struggling to survive under Allied radar-guided assaults night after night, hunted by the same technology they had once mocked. And still, among British civilians, the carrot story persisted as gospel truth. Mothers told their children to eat carrots like the pilots. Farmers taught the same to their sons. Even when rationing ended years later, the association between carrots and eyesight remained embedded in public belief. A myth born from necessity had become cultural truth. By the time radar's full story was declassified after the war, most Britons were astonished. Few had ever guessed that their nightly meals, their cheerful posters, and their beloved Cat's Eyes hero were part of a national deception. Yet, in a way, it didn't matter. The lie had protected something real, something worth the secrecy. Because in the end, the story of the carrot wasn't about vegetables or vitamins. It was about vision, the vision to see beyond the obvious, to deceive wisely, and to fight with intellect rather than brute force. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged blinking into a new age, one defined not only by atomic power and global reconstruction, but by the dawn of the electronic era. In the ruins of Europe, secrets began to surface. Captured documents, declassified research, and Allied reports revealed the invisible war that had raged across the electromagnetic spectrum. And for the first time, the full truth of Britain's wartime radar network was made public. The revelation stunned even those who had lived through the Blitz. Ordinary Britons, who had spent years believing in the comforting legend of carrots and cat's eyes pilots, learned that the real savior of their nights had been radio waves, oscilloscopes, and the silent hum of transmitters hidden along the coast. The lie, so simple and harmless, was suddenly recast as one of the cleverest acts of wartime deception ever executed. In post-war interviews, RAF veterans recalled the tension of keeping the secret. Some had carried it for decades, bound by the Official Secrets Act. John Cunningham, the man immortalized as Cat's Eyes, remained characteristically understated. In a 1950 BBC interview, when asked whether the carrot story had ever fooled the Germans, he smiled faintly and said, "I rather hope it did." His understatement concealed a truth that intelligence historians would later confirm. The deception had fooled them completely. Captured Luftwaffe officers after the war admitted that German intelligence had accepted the carrot story as plausible, particularly after seeing the British government's relentless promotion of it. In their minds, no nation would publicly advertise its greatest military secret, therefore, the story had to be true. It was, in retrospect, the perfect paradox of deception. As radar's true history emerged, the narrative of the war itself changed. Historians began to see the Battle of Britain and the Blitz not just as triumphs of courage, but as triumphs of science, organization, and information control. The carrot myth, once a sideshow anecdote, became a symbol of how intelligence and propaganda could shape reality. Wartime Britain had not just hidden radar, it had managed the perception of an entire nation and its enemies through carefully crafted misinformation. It was, in many ways, the first large-scale experiment in psychological operations, or what later military theorists would call psyops. This philosophy would go on to shape the Cold War. In a world now defined by espionage, code-breaking, and information warfare, the carrot myth stood as an early case study in how belief could be engineered for strategic ends. But the story didn't fade into textbooks. It lived on softly, humorously in the culture that had birthed it. Decades later, the phrase "carrots help you see in the dark" remained a staple of British childhoods. Parents still repeated it at dinner tables, long after its original purpose had been forgotten. Few realized that behind the innocence of that line lay one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in modern history. In 1993, the Imperial War Museum unveiled an exhibition titled "Science and Secrecy: Britain's Hidden Weapons of World War II." Among the radar displays and engineering models stood a small glass case containing something ordinary, a cluster of wartime Ministry of Food posters, bright and cheerful, urging citizens to eat more carrots. Beside them, a simple placard read, "The Carrot Story, one of Britain's greatest cover-ups." A harmless myth that helped protect the deadliest secret of the war: radar. Visitors smiled, some laughing aloud. Others lingered in thought. For many, it was the first time they realized that propaganda didn't always deceive to harm. Sometimes it deceived to protect. The legacy of that deception endured far beyond the war. It reshaped how governments understood the relationship between truth and security, between information and power. And it left behind an unlikely monument, not a fortress or a weapon, but a vegetable, standing quietly as a symbol of cunning, courage, and ingenuity. The carrot, bright and ordinary, became a metaphor for a nation's ability to fight in the shadows, to see without being seen, and to win without being known. By the time Cunningham passed away in 2002, the radar towers he once defended had long since been dismantled. But the myth he embodied, the cat's eyes pilot who saw through darkness, had already entered legend. History would remember the technology. Folklore would remember the carrots. And together, they told a story that no weapon ever could, that in the darkest nights of war, victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the cleverest. The stupid carrot myth born in the dark days of 1940 was never about vegetables, or vitamins, or even eyesight. It was about vision in the truest sense, the ability to see beyond what others believe, to use perception as both weapon and shield. In a war defined by fire and steel, Britain's quietest victory came from silence, from scientists working in secrecy, from airmen trusting invisible instruments, and from a nation believing in a lie so harmless that it saved countless lives. It was the perfect deception, small, believable, and profoundly human. While Germany boasted of technological supremacy, Britain disguised its own under a story told to children. And in doing so, it rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Radar may have guided the bowfighters through the night skies, but it was storytelling that protected radar itself. That paradox, the union of truth and myth, defined the intelligence war of the 20th century. The carrot myth endures today, often retold with a smile, as one of history's quaint misunderstandings. Yet, behind that smile lies a blueprint for how nations survive under threat, through the mastery of information. In a way, the British Ministry of Information's brilliance wasn't in inventing a lie, it was in choosing one people wanted to believe. In a world blacked out by fear, a story about carrots and cat's eyes pilots offered comfort, colour, and hope. It gave shape to courage in a form anyone could understand. Because war, at its core, is not only fought with bullets and machines, but with imagination. When we remember the Battle of Britain, we picture Spitfires and sirens, flames and resolve. But somewhere beyond the glare of explosions, unseen radio waves were drawing lines in the sky, invisible defences that no bomb could touch. And behind those defences stood an entire nation, believing that a carrot could conquer darkness. They were wrong, of course, but gloriously so. Because in believing the myth, they protected the truth. And sometimes in the fog of war, that is what vision truly means, not the power to see what is real, but the wisdom to hide it until victory is won.